Hello and welcome to our discussion of the selling, general, and administrative budget. So the thing I want to mention with this, we've already gone through the manufacturing overhead budget in another lecture. This is another type of overhead budget. It's often referred to as overhead, but it's not manufacturing related. Instead, we're talking about the office or the store. When you think of overhead, this, before you get into accounting at least, this is really what you generally think about. You think about overhead like running the store, the utilities, the office costs, and those are all selling general administrative type costs, or SG&A. Now this one comes after the production budgets. We've already completed those. Now I guess when I say it comes after it, it really doesn't need to. You don't need the production budgets to support this. Instead, what you need is the sales budget, because this generally relates to the number of units sold, at least for the selling costs, and really for any of the variable costs, it tends to be related to the number of units sold. So again, we have the sales budget, then we completed the production budget, we completed all three of the production cost type budgets, and the selling general administrative budget is just down here by itself. Again, it relates to the sales budget, but it has no linkage to the three green production cost budgets. But notice it does have a direct linkage to both the cash budget as well as the budgeted income statement. Really doesn't lead to the budgeted balance sheet. It's an expense and it's a cash outflow. But as we talked about before with the manufacturing overhead cost budget, we said there are some of those manufacturing overhead costs that are not actually cash related. They're not cash payments in that period. This would include depreciation. So when you have depreciation, you bought that years ago, that asset, and now you're paying, or you're recording it as an expense, but you're not paying cash for it. All of your other selling general administrative costs would also lead to a cash payment this period. So very similar to the manufacturing overhead budget in that it has both variable and fixed costs related to it. Now, I already just mentioned that the depreciation needs to be separately considered because you're not paying cash for it. So a lot of times they'll give you the information. Some of the budgets carve it out right now so that you know both an expense and a cash payment, but not all of them do. Sometimes you'll just see the cash kind of adjustment in the cash budget itself, cash disbursements budget, and that's perfectly fine. Like the manufacturing overhead budget, we need to know two things. We need to know the variable overhead rate, and I say per cost driver unit. Sometimes this is just the number of units sold. That may be the case there. It quite frequently is. Sometimes it's sales dollars. They may want to use that. You could be going back to labor or machine hours, but that's more production related. So it tends to more commonly be something sales related. And then the fixed overhead amount per unit, again, it's not really based on the level of production. It's a lot of times based on just how much cost did you have for that store, what was the rent for the store, CEO's salary, all the accounting staff salaries, any of that stuff. Now the types of fixed overhead budgets are slightly different here. I mean, we still have depreciation, we still have salaries for various staff members, we have rent. But the big difference is the keywords, or they're not going to be factory or manufacturing or product. Those are for manufacturing overhead. The keywords here are office, store, administrative, anything like that. So the depreciation would be on office or store buildings or equipment, office or store salaries, and any salaries for office or store support staff like security and janitorial, and of course rent for the same buildings. Again, the key word here is office or store. Sometimes they'll give you a big list of costs that you have in your company for a period, and you need to put them into their proper category. Just remember the breakdown: factory versus office or store. Now, variable overhead costs, again, really the same types, except we have one new one. Utilities, to some extent, as I said, they could be fixed or variable or a little bit of both. Supplies, if we use supplies in our store. Any hourly wages for the same support staff we talked about in the last slide. And a big one you'll see here that's different is sales commissions. So sales salaries would be a fixed overhead cost for the SG&A budget, but sales commissions, which are very common, and they're obviously a selling related cost, they go here under variable because they directly relate to the amount of sales you had, whether it be units or dollars. So here's what a budget would look like for that. We'd have the 3 different months here: April, May, and June, of course, and the quarter, the quarterly total. So in this case, again, a lot of it's based on the number of units sold rather than produced. So here we have 8,500, 18,000, and 21,000. We had quite a bit of an increase from April to May. And they have a rate. In this case, it's a rate per number of units sold, which is pretty common for variable selling, general, administrative. So we have that. We have our total variable SG&A. And then we're going to add in various things: fixed salaries, fixed rent, fixed insurance, fixed depreciation, fixed supplies. So supplies could go either way, fixed or variable. In this case, we're saying they're fixed. Now, as I mentioned before, depreciation needs to be somehow separately identified because, yes, it's an expense, but it's not a cash payment. Here we get a subtotal for all the fixed, and we get a grand total for all of our budgeted SG&A. As I mentioned also before, sometimes they'll take this and then they'll have another line beneath it saying less depreciation expense, less non-cash depreciation expense equals budgeted SG&A cash outflow, something like that. We'll see why that's important when we get to the cash budget. And that takes us to the end of our selling general administrative budget discussion. Hopefully this has helped to clarify the difference between the two, how this budget fits into the whole master budget. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to talking to you in the next session.